My name's Duncan. For those who don't know me, I am the youth pastor here. You might be able to tell from my voice that I do not come from these ends. I am from about 420 miles north, the capital city of Scotland, Edinburgh. And I moved down to London about 5 years ago in 2 weeks to pursue doing a degree in theology and youth ministry, and also came here to work for Every Nation London. I've been doing so for the past 5 years, and it is not only my honor, but my absolute joy to get to lead our 11 to 18-year-olds in this church. And they're joining us in the service today. I'm excited to see. So we've been in this series called Life-Giving Conversations with Jesus. And we've been doing this for quite a while now, if you've been around. This will be our ninth part of the series, I believe. And so today I am going to be talking to you guys about a conversation that Jesus had with Peter, with one of the disciples, and talking specifically about a life-giving conversation with Jesus about perspective. But who knows that every concept needs a context? And the concept we're discussing today is perspective. And so before I tell you what the verse is, before we read the verse, I want to give you some history, some background leading up to the point from which we will look at. So the point we're going to look at, the disciples have been following Jesus for, we reckon, approximately just over 3 years. And over that time, the disciples have seen Jesus do many, many miracles. They've seen Jesus feed the 5,000, feed the 4,000, heal people on the road. Yet somehow they still have a bit of a lack of faith, even to the point where they're on another trip with Jesus and they're fretting because they've forgotten to bring the bread with them. But it seems like they've forgotten who the God is that they serve. There are a few things that seem to just go over the disciples' heads as Jesus is calling them to a place of maturity in their discipleship. Then we have the Pharisees, these religious leaders, and they don't like Jesus because he's not playing by their rules, and they're calling him a false teacher. They think he's sort of roaming about the place just spouting blasphemies. So they step up their mission to try and kill Jesus. Not the best way to deal with opposition, by the way. Jesus knows this is happening, so he takes his disciples and withdraws to an area called Caesarea Philippi, which is in the very northern part of Israel. And he starts teaching the disciples what it'll look like for him to be Israel's Messiah. And it's not what anyone was thinking. Jesus asks the disciples who they say he is, and Peter's response is, "You're the Son of the living God." And that's where we're going to pick up this morning. And we're going to read in Matthew 16, verse 21 to 23. From then on, Jesus began to tell his disciples plainly that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem and that he would suffer many terrible things at the hands of the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He would be killed, but on the third day, he would be raised from the dead. But Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. "Heaven forbid, Lord," he said, "this will never happen to you." Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Get away from me, Satan. You're a dangerous trap to me. You're seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's." So it seems that Peter thought that Jesus was going to be a king that reigned politically over the nation of Israel, rather than the truth. His point of view was all wrong. And that's where we're going to focus our attention today, is really on those last couple of sentences. You are seeing things from a human point of view, not from God's. Jesus then goes on after these verses to explain to the disciples, using themes from Isaiah in the Old Testament, that the Messianic king would suffer and die for the sins of the people. And Jesus was trying to realign the disciples' perspective and show them that the Messianic King reigns by serving the people and giving his life for Israel and the nations. But Peter and the disciples, they just don't really get it. And we actually see as we read on that it takes quite a while. Even after Jesus is crucified, some of them still, they just don't get it. And they've been walking with Jesus so closely for such an amount of time. So I want to make quickly some comments on verse 21 and 22, and then we're going to zoom in more on verse 23. So I'm going to read again those parts of the verses. So from then on, Jesus began to tell his disciples plainly that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem and that he would suffer many terrible things at the hands of the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He would be killed, but on the third day he would be raised from the dead. So here Jesus is describing exactly how he's going to become king. It's brutal, but he's facing the facts, and he's being honest with the disciples. He's telling the disciples the truth. But this clearly isn't what the disciples want to hear. They've been walking with him for this 3-year period. They've become brothers. They've become closest of friends. And to hear that he's going to die, they just can't compute. They're hoping they're going to be able to share in the glory. When he's the king of Israel, they'll be able to stand with him. Maybe they'll get good jobs in the kingdom of Israel because of their king and their friend. And in general, Jesus' teachings challenged the way that the disciples were brought up. It challenged the way that the disciples' faith was instilled in them as young children even. But this just went to the next level. Verse 22, but Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. Heaven forbid, Lord, he said, this will never happen to you. Firstly, who reprimands Jesus? That's just foolish. It's clear that Peter doesn't really have a full grasp of who he's talking to. Secondly, and on a more ironic point, if heaven forbid really is the language that he used, that's quite ironic because if Jesus had listened to Peter, we would literally still be forbidden from heaven because Jesus wouldn't have gone to the cross. Yeah, side point. But for real though, these words coming out of Peter's mouth, they show where his perspective is. They show his lack of judgment. Shows that he's thinking from a human point of view, not from God's, as Jesus has said to him. So Jesus' reaction. Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Get away from me, Satan. You're a dangerous trap to me. You're seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's." So Peter's basically just called Jesus wrong and crazy, and Jesus responds with probably one of the most savage sentences in the entire Bible. "Get away from me, Satan," or "get behind me, Satan," as some translations say, making a point about how ridiculous and demonic Peter's comments were. So now I want us to take a look at Peter's perspective from what we see there, and then look at Jesus' perspective and see how they differ. So Peter's perspective is selfish, dangerous. He was thinking big but wrong, and he's thinking short term. So let me break those down a little bit. He's selfish. Peter thought that if Jesus went to die, he'd be without his leader. He'd be without his friend, his brother that's led him so well for the past 3 years. And if Jesus was to rule as king of Israel, then maybe he would have a place in the kingdom of Israel, politically speaking. He's dangerous. He's being dangerous to the mission of God. Of course, Jesus isn't going to listen to Peter. Jesus is God. He's not going to listen to what Peter is saying. But if he did, then Peter would be very dangerous to the mission of God. So side point, don't be dangerous to the mission of God, be dangerous to the mission of the enemy. He was thinking big, but wrong. Peter wasn't thinking small, so nobody can accuse him of that. He's thinking big, and he's thinking about how great it would be if Jesus was this political leader, how great it would be if he could lead the military and he could lead Israel to be the best nation that it could be. But Peter's thinking short term. He's thinking of the here and now. He's thinking of the difference it would make today. And that's not evil in itself, but it's not God's perspective. And if it's not God's perspective, then it's probably not God's will. And if it's not God's will, then maybe it is sin. Let's look at Jesus' perspective. Jesus had a mission from the Father that he needed to complete. He was committed to the will of God, the will of the Father. Jesus knew the importance of what was to come, and he was committed to the mission that he'd been given by his Father. He knew it was his Father's will, and therefore he took it completely seriously, and he wasn't going to let his friend Peter get in the way. He knew the enemy was out to stop him from doing what his mission was. He knew the enemy was going to try and stop him doing what he needed to do. Jesus knew, and Jesus knows, that the enemy makes plans too. And he'd faced him before. He knew to be vigilant to any attempts of the devil. And he knew what the enemy's voice sounded like, even when it came from a friend. Jesus, his thinking wasn't in the moment, but on the greater plan for mankind. Unlike Peter, who seemed to be focused on short-term gain, Jesus had an eternal mindset. He knew that what was coming was going to bridge a gap forever between the Father and us. And that a few days of the most horrendous torture and pain known to man would be absolutely worth it. So I want to talk just a little bit about perspective. Who here likes to swim? A few. Okay, I really, really enjoy swimming. It is my exercise of choice for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's the exercise that requires the least amount of work. And two, if a whale can do it, so can I. And I went swimming from when I was a very young lad. My parents would take me to swimming lessons. I learned to swim very young. And over the years, I would go to these amazing swimming pools. You've probably been to one at some point, either like a Olympic or Commonwealth-sized pool, full-size pool. And then you have the Olympic diving boards off to one side. And so I would see those diving boards, and I would look at them and think, oh, that looks fun. And so I'd walk over to those diving boards, walk around the pool. You know, everyone's having a good time swimming. There's a bunch of people diving off the first couple of boards. And I'd look up to the top and I'd say, you know what? That's not actually that high. I can do that. And so, jump, not dive. And so I walk around the side of the pool, past the line of the kids and teenagers queuing up to jump off the first couple of boards. And up I go, my legs sort of getting weaker and weaker as I get to the top, to the 10-meter board. And only when I walk to the very edge, I see my perspective has completely changed. Now I can see the whole pool. I can see everybody. I can see people having coffee in the cafe outside. I can see kids in the soft play area that's up on this level. And I can even see out to the road where there's drivers going past, looking in, wondering why this red-haired guy is shaking so badly at the top of this diving board. What's my point? My human perspective said that going up there and jumping off would be easy. Like, it really doesn't look that high. When I got to the top, I got to see a bit of what God sees. I got to see through God's perspective for a moment. I got to see the bigger picture. I got to see that God's perspective isn't always easy. That wasn't easy for me standing at the top of that diving board looking around. In fact, that perspective made it harder. It made it more difficult. God's perspective isn't easy because it exposes reality. And honestly, reality is not usually the easiest thing. The only thing stopping me from climbing back down the stairs and not jumping off the diving board was the knowledge that if I just took that step of faith and trusted that that 5-meter pool of water would catch me after that horrendous 10-meter drop, that I would maybe overcome something, that I'd maybe have a positive experience to walk away from and not go away feeling like I'd missed out. And on a much, much, much larger scale, perspective was one of the reasons that Jesus was able to endure the crucifixion. He looked past his current circumstances. He looked past the pain to the joy that was set before him. It says in Hebrews 12, verse 2, "For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." Guys, God's perspective doesn't just help us say the right things. Like if Peter had said the right thing, Jesus would still know what he was thinking. It doesn't help us do the right things all the time, but it helps us endure the tougher sides of life because we can see the bigger picture. We're not isolated anymore. We're not self-absorbed anymore. When we look at Peter, though, he was getting in the way of himself being able to hear and see through God's perspective and effectively standing in the way of his own salvation. But we know that Peter has heard from God before because if we just rewind a few chapters, we see something interesting. In Matthew 16:17, just a few verses before, it says, "Then he asked him, 'But who do you say I am?' Simon Peter answered, 'You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God.' Jesus replied, 'You are blessed, Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. You did not learn this from any human being.'" This is the last verse that we see Peter being called Simon Peter. The next verse after this, Jesus says, "From now on, you're Peter." So Peter had seen with God's perspective before, but for whatever reason this time, his own ideas seemed better than God's perspective. And sometimes we choose to listen or not listen to what God wants to say to us. So I mentioned earlier that every concept, if you like, needs a context, and the concept we're looking at is perspective. The context of Jesus and Peter's conversation, well, that's never going to happen again. Jesus has already gone to the cross. He's already died for our sins. Hallelujah, we don't have to have that conversation with Jesus. But we as Christians, though, now we have this job to figure out what it means for us today, what this means for our everyday lives, or rather how our everyday lives fit into God's perspective. There's not an area of our lives that could not or cannot benefit from having a little bit more of God's perspective. And so to go forward, I want to answer a couple of questions. The questions I want to answer are these. What are the dangers of living under our human perspective? And how do we shift from our own human perspective to God's perspective? So what are the dangers of living under our own human perspectives? Well, there are many. For Peter, the very real danger was that Jesus could listen to him and could mess up the whole plan. And we'd still not have the possibility of being reconciled to God. But for us, without God's perspective, we follow our own natural inclinations. And I know for me personally, if I follow my own natural inclinations and my own desires, I'm probably going to end up in quite a dark place. So I want to address what these dangers could look like in a few different areas, some common areas. As I said before, there's not an area in our lives that couldn't benefit from more of God's perspective. But I want to look at career, relationships, and finance. Three big common themes, I think, in almost everybody's lives. So, firstly, careers. Maybe you struggle to see how any good could come from the job that you're currently in, or you don't feel that you've got to the level that you thought you should be at by now. But when you zoom out, maybe there's 25 people on your team that haven't experienced the love of Jesus yet, and suddenly your perspective can change to be less about you and more about the mission of God. Before I moved to London, I worked in property management. I managed flats and houses for landlords who didn't want to do it themselves. And I was with one company for a year, and it went spectacularly bust. And another company came along and said, hey, we want to take on all your landlords. We'll give you a job if you help bring them over. I said, yay, went on over. And before I knew it, I'd become really good friends with both of the directors of the company and had basically got to know everybody in the company. And it got to the stage where one of the directors was taking me out for boxing training at lunch, and then we'd come back to the office, he'd cook lunch. 3 hours would have passed, we're back to work, and then we'd close the office at 5 and go home. And the other director would invite me around to his house and give me designer clothes, and they gave me a car, and all seemed kind of sweet. And I had an incredible opportunity in that workplace where there was not one person who worked in that company that I didn't get to share my faith with. There wasn't one person there that I wasn't building a relationship with that was opening doors to the gospel. And what did I do? I had been meeting with a director of another company who had invited me to come and join their firm as a partner. And I jumped at the opportunity. But here was my mistake. I left that company to go to another company just so that I could have director on my business card. I gave up the opportunity of leading a whole office to Jesus. Who knows, that could have happened. I was having real opportunities to share my faith, but I walked away because I was glorifying myself and I wanted director on my business card. Maybe you find yourself in a similar situation. Maybe you find yourself in a difficult position in your career. But if you just zoom out, if I had zoomed out, I know what I would have done. And I always had this little feeling that I should have stayed with that first company. Relationships. Maybe you're sadly in a position where you feel like your marriage is falling apart. Maybe you feel like there's nothing that can be done to fix it. Maybe you feel like you've married the wrong person. I remember one of the most amazing married couples that I know that have had an influence in my life. For the first year of their marriage, she was so sure she'd married the wrong guy. And they've spent years in ministry, have done incredible things for God, and they're now in retirement. But maybe that's you. And when you fail to zoom out and see God's perspective, you fail to see the reconciliation that He's planning and the beautiful things that He wants to do through your marriage and your family, but you miss it and you go your separate ways and you miss out on all God had planned for your family. And guys, I know marriage is not as clear-cut as that, and neither is divorce, but it's an example. Or maybe you're single, and the person God has for you is standing right in front of you, but you're discounting them because your human perspective has so many reasons why it wouldn't work, couldn't work, shouldn't work, because your human perspective is just getting in the way. But from God's perspective, He's got an incredible journey ahead for the two of you. Don't miss out. Finances. The easiest way to tell if you've got a human perspective of money is if you imagine giving it away and you start to feel uncomfortable. Or if your first thought is about how damaging that would be to the kingdom that you're trying to build yourself. But on another note, if you don't have any money and you're completely broke and you know that God has something planned for you, you know that there's something that God wants you to do and it's specific, but you feel like you can't do it because you don't have the money, don't let having no money get in the way of that either. As a good German friend of mine used to say, if it's God's will, it's God's bill. And I believe that. I've seen it. Of course, these are just examples, but my point here is about the dangers of the human perspective. I don't want us, and I don't think Jesus wants us to miss out on all that God has for us because we fail to see the bigger picture. But there's also danger that we stay as spiritual babies and don't grow up. Having a godly perspective is also evidence of spiritual maturity, as it is written in Hebrews 5:14. But solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. Powers of discernment. Which takes me on to my next question. How do we shift from our own human perspective to God's perspective? How do we shift from our own human perspective to God's perspective? Now, there are a couple of verses that can help us figure this out. Firstly, back to our main text for today. Peter's in conversation with Jesus. He's thinking about short-term gain when God's perspective was eternal. So practically, we can ask ourselves when facing difficult decisions and situations, how does this affect the bigger picture of God's kingdom? How does this affect eternity? How does this fit in with eternity? And in 1 Corinthians we read, "It was to us that God revealed these things by his Spirit. For his Spirit searches out everything and shows us God's deep secrets. No one can know a person's thoughts except that person's own spirit. And no one can know God's thoughts except God's own Spirit. And we have received God's Spirit, not the world's spirit, so that we can know the wonderful things God has freely given us." It then goes on to say, "Who can know the Lord's thoughts? Who knows enough to teach him? But we understand these things, for we have the mind of Christ." So we have access through the Spirit to the mind of Christ, which is God's perspective. We have access through the Spirit to the mind of Christ, which is God's perspective. And throughout the Bible, words like understanding, wisdom, and discernment are used when describing perspective. The opposite being hardness of heart, blindness, and dullness. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be dull, blind, and hard of heart. That doesn't sound very great. So we must pray for understanding, wisdom, and discernment. God promises these things in his word if we simply ask. We always hear about, if you ask for wisdom, it shall be given to you freely. But how often do we actually ask for wisdom? And it's great to start your year that way, your month that way, even your day that way. But do we do that when we have big decisions to make? When we're in deep conversations, do we ask for God's wisdom? Do we ask for God's perspective? So, to think with the perspective of God. Firstly, let's be aware of our thoughts and our decision-making process. Invite God into that. Think about how your actions affect the bigger picture of God's kingdom and eternity. And ask God for understanding, wisdom, and discernment regularly, especially when making big decisions. To finish this morning, I want to read you a quote. It's not a quote that comes from a scholar or from any great source other than yesterday when I messaged my father-in-law telling him what we were going to be talking about today. He sent me this in response. He said, "Two truths are undeniable. God is God and I am not. God's tapestry of a magnificent plan often goes unnoticed or unseen because we have our nose too close to the moment and fail to see the big picture that our Father has laid out." I want to read that again. Two truths are undeniable. God is God, and I am not. God's tapestry of a magnificent plan often goes unnoticed or unseen because we have our nose too close to the moment and fail to see the big picture that our Father has laid out. Let's not keep our noses too close to the moment. Let's not miss out on the bigger picture of what God has for us. Every nation, let's be a people that seek God's perspective over our own human perspective. And let's see this great tapestry for the true beauty that it is. In a second, we're going to just take 3 minutes for you guys to just think through what we've been discussing. And there's going to be a couple of questions on the screen for you to answer. If you're comfortable, you can turn to the person next to you and have that conversation. But if you'd rather just think on those things, just tell the person next to you. So I just really want to think about this by myself a little bit more. But after that, I really would encourage you, if you feel like there's some things in your life that have been a real mess, if you feel like your life just hasn't gone the way it should have in some areas, and this resonates with you and you feel that's maybe because of a lack of God's perspective and you've been living in your own human perspective, then I encourage you to come and be prayed for by the ministry team. And as I was preparing for this, I just had a sense that there were maybe 2 or 3 people today that would never normally want to go up for ministry, that wouldn't feel comfortable going up for ministry normally. But today he wants you to come forward and receive some prayer and some freedom in that area. So those questions are going to come up on the screen and you're going to have 3 minutes to answer those.